We're here tonight because the Energy Department is proposing a cleanup plan for the liquid waste discharge sites from plutonium processing on Hanford's Central Plateau. And there's enough plutonium in the soil on Hanford's Central Plateau to make more than 70 nuclear weapons. And after the Energy Department is done cleaning it up, there'll still be enough plutonium in the soil to make dozens of nuclear weapons unless we change their plan. They are regulated by the US Environmental Protection Agency and Washington Department of Ecology, who have to approve this cleanup plan. So feel free to direct your comments to them tonight as well as to the Energy Department. The three agencies together comprise what they call the Tri-Party Agreement agencies, and you'll hear them talking about the Tri-Party Agreement, which means the Hanford Cleanup Agreement, which is the schedule for cleaning up Hanford. Here's a chart showing how much plutonium there is in the Central Plateau soil at Hanford. These are Energy Department statistics for how much plutonium there is. And you see the liquid waste discharge ditches, cribs, trenches, that's their name for these trenches, has 562 kilograms of plutonium. That's enough to make more than 70 nuclear weapons from scratch. The unlined trenches in which solid wastes were placed, for which there are 43 miles of trenches if they were stacked end to end, have 370 kilograms of plutonium, and the commercial radioactive waste dump operated by Washington State in the center of Hanford has over 100 kilograms of plutonium. So if people saw the agency announcement for this meeting, and let me ask, how many of you saw the agency mailing? A couple? Okay, a lot of people didn't. The Tri-Party Agreement agencies, it said proposed plan for the remediation of the 200 CW5, PW1, PW, whatever, right? So most people didn't pay attention to it. What it means is the plutonium liquid waste discharge sites. Hanford operated plutonium processing plants on the Central Plateau to extract plutonium from fuel rods, melting it down in acid, extracting the plutonium, small amounts, and then discharging vast quantities of liquid waste. The hottest waste went into tanks. The rest went straight into the ground. 470 billion gallons. Huge quantity of waste straight to the soil at Hanford. Not ancient history. Heart of America Northwest had to sue the Energy Department to stop discharging untreated liquid wastes in 1993. These discharges that we're talking about tonight, some of them continued until 1995. So not ancient history. And we're not just talking about plutonium tonight. There's highly radioactive cesium, which is much more radioactive as a gamma emitter, and there's a ton of different chemicals, particularly solvents that were chosen and designed to mobilize plutonium as they processed it. So if it's really good for mobilizing plutonium in the chemical processes, guess what? It's really good for mobilizing it in the soil, like carbon tetrachloride. Here's a map of Hanford. I'm sorry, it doesn't really show very well. Washington State, the Columbia River is running through Hanford for 50 miles here. It's been designated a national monument. The bluffs, there are 9 reactors along the river. And the area we're focused on tonight is called the Central Plateau in here. And here's a better map of the Central Plateau's location. And it's divided into an area on the east side and the west side. And the area in the middle of them is the massive cleanup landfill and the commercial radioactive waste dump that's unlined and leaking. And this is an Energy Department picture of how wastes went into the soil from the different plutonium operations. And there, you look at it and you go, there doesn't seem to be much difference between a crib, dirt trench, and a trench, or a crib, or a tank, or a tile field. And there isn't much. The agencies have divided these areas into 4 operable units, which is a super fun term for the area they're cleaning up. And it's really hard to follow their proposal, and you shouldn't hesitate tonight to say, wait a minute, which ones are you talking about? Are you talking about the trenches, the tanks, the ditches, the ones with lots of plutonium, or the ones with cesium? Because they name these things, the names were designed to confuse the Russian spies. So 216Z1, you had to be an insider to know Z meant plutonium finishing plant. Of course, the Russians knew that. Only people who were confused were us. There's a view inside one of the trenches and ditches, the Z9 trench. This is a famous one because so much plutonium was discharged in the liquid that the Energy Department in the 1970s became concerned that there was going to be a self-sustaining nuclear reaction in the trench. And they went in and they dug out 127 pounds of plutonium, which is enough to make more than a dozen nuclear bombs. But what's surprising is how much is still left in here. And massive amounts of carbon tetrachloride, which is not only a solvent, but a powerful carcinogen, neurotoxin, and becomes chloroform when it degrades. It moves through the soil as a gas as well as a liquid, and it's really good at moving other contaminants. And the plutonium 40 years ago was known to be already 100 feet below the surface of this trench.
40 years ago?
Yeah. Here's another view of it. Actually, let me show you. One of the more bizarre things about this picture is that this is a cement roof 120 feet wide over the trench. And there's a staircase down into it. And ever since they published these photos, I've been wondering, who is the poor sucker who had to go into the trench? And what were they told? Like, why would you have a staircase down into it, and who went down? And my guess is that it was their summer interns. This is one of 5 what they call high salt plutonium waste trenches. High salt is a misnomer for, sounds like table salt. It's the ones with the most chemicals in them. So when you hear them say 5 high salt plutonium trenches tonight, translate the word salt into organic chemicals that are really good solvents, as well as lots of other chemicals.
All right, so right now, the Department of Energy's plan is to dig to the bottom of the most heavily concentrated plutonium and then just dig 2 feet deeper. And so, that leaves a lot of plutonium in place, at least 100 feet deep already, and that's what we know. And the way that the Department of Energy decided how far to dig is they did testing. So they tested Z ditches in the 1950s and the 1970s, but they only tested them for radionuclides that time. Only, they ignored any other chemical. They were just looking at the plutonium, the americium, and these other, radionuclides. In 2002, they did new testing for all the nuclides in there. That includes the dangerous chemicals that we mentioned earlier. But in 2002, they only tested one spot. It was a worst-case site. Ironically, though, the max concentrations for the radionuclides in that worst-case spot were far less than the spots that they had tested in the 1970s. So here's a map of where they tested, and these are the Z ditches filled with plutonium and different radionuclides and chemicals, we think. It's 2 miles long, and in 1959, they tested this one area. In 1979, they tested this area. And again, this wasn't testing for chemicals, just radionuclides. And in 2002, they tested that one spot. And that is all we know in the last 30 years about what chemicals are in the trenches and how far down they go. Right now, Department of Energy's estimate is that the chemicals in the other trenches have moved 2 feet downward. But since there hasn't been testing done within the past 30 years, it's a little hard to substantiate that.
There are also, in what they call the PW3 unit, 5 really radioactive sites with cesium. Cesium has a 30-year half-life, unlike plutonium, whose half-life is 24,000 years. So it'll take 300 years for the cesium to disappear, essentially, but it is extremely radioactive cesium. And cesium is not the only thing that is in these waste trenches, of course. There is plutonium. There's a lot of organic chemicals that are very dangerous and, again, really good solvents. And here's the Energy Department's proposed cleanup plan. We call it cover-up, not cleanup. Put 15 feet of dirt on top of it and leave it. Now, we know from other waste sites that cesium, for instance, from high-level nuclear waste tank leaks, where the Energy Department said it would never move far away from the tanks, has already moved 150 feet or deeper and reached groundwater. But that type of information is ignored in these proposed plans and this investigation. Well, there isn't really an investigation, it turns out. Why? The Energy Department says the cesium, like plutonium, sticks to the soil and won't move. But all the evidence in other places shows it does. And they say no one's going to build here or excavate. But we know that's not something you can predict in 50 years, much less 500 years. So their proposed plan says plutonium, cesium, strontium are not a threat to groundwater because they stick to the soil and won't move. And ironically, they admit that plutonium under that one trench, which they don't want to clean up, is already 100 feet down below, which defies their model. The drinking water standard for plutonium, this is if you drank this much plutonium in your water every day, 1 out of every 10,000 adults would die. Probably 1 out of 1,000 children would die of cancer. It's 15 picocuries per liter. Picocurie is a very small quantity of radiation measurement. The peak level projected in last year's environmental impact statement that many of you came to the public meeting on, last year the Energy Department had spent $40 million doing modeling, much more intensive modeling of what would happen to wastes in Hanford Central Plateau. And it predicted that the plutonium in the groundwater in this area would reach 2,660 picocuries per liter. Remember, tonight they're going to say plutonium doesn't move. Last year's model said it will move, and it's going to reach the groundwater at this massive concentration, hundreds of times drinking water standard. And this is a chart from their EIS showing that it's going to even be higher along the Columbia River. This is from that EIS last year, showing a map of Hanford, and unfortunately it doesn't show well on here. The river is running through here for 50 miles. So this is, and this rectangle is the Central Plateau. This is carbon tetrachloride. In the darkest area is 50 times the drinking water standard. This is the projection of what happens to it in the year 2135, moving towards the river. This is uranium moving out of the waste sites into the groundwater towards the river in 125 years. And this is uranium 2,000 years from now, still moving out of the waste sites into the groundwater. This is iodine, radioactive iodine, very dangerous, very low drinking water standard, moving out of the waste sites for thousands of years. They project the radioactive iodine will contaminate the drinking water underneath Hanford for 10,000 years if we leave the waste there. The Energy Department was criticized by the National Academy of Science 11 years ago for proposing to just put caps, dirt over sites and say that we'll keep people away from the sites forever, called institutional controls. The cleanup slides, the cleanup levels here, we want to give you a little bit of comparison. The Energy Department tonight is proposing a cleanup level, saying if we see the plutonium above this level, we'll clean it up, and if it's below this level, we'll leave it. And that level is 2,900 picocuries per gram. So all you need to know is there's a measurement of radiation. It's a very low level of radiation in terms of picocuries, what that measures, 2,900. At Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, the Energy Department is being required to clean up plutonium in parts of the lab to 2.5 or 10. Hanford's proposing 2,900. How else do we compare? At the Johnson Atoll, where we blew up nuclear bombs, the Energy Department is being required to clean up to a level of 2.1 to 210. At Rocky Flats, they're being required to clean up to 116. At Lawrence Livermore, as I said, 2.5 to 10. Along the Columbia River, the Energy Department agreed to clean up to a level of 35 picocuries per gram. And now we're proposing about 1,000 times more. And we'll call that safe forever. And I'm going to turn it back over to Ross to talk about whether or not this plan meets legal requirements.
And the short answer to that is that it does not. The federal Superfund law allows states to set more rigorous laws for cleanup, and Washington has chosen to do that. Washington hazardous law applies to all hazardous waste deposited or stored after 1985. And some of the ditches in Hanford and operated after and received waste after 1985, and some of the tanks still store waste today. So clearly they're subject to Washington hazardous waste law. But the plan Department of Energy is proposing only meets the standards for federal law, which, as I said, are much lower than state law. Here's how it matters. Federal law, you see the maximum acceptable cancer risk is 1 person in 10,000, whereas the state law, the maximum acceptable risk is 1 in 100,000. It's 10 times more strict. The Department of Energy doesn't need a permit under federal law. They do under state law, which would limit their ability more. They don't need to actually report what chemical quantities are in the trenches. And as you saw, they've been neglecting to do so for at least 30 years. Under state law, they would need to do so. They don't need to clean up to the extent practicable under federal law, whereas state law they do. So that means that under federal law, they can weigh costs and benefits of cleanup, and maybe if it costs too much, they don't have to do it. And finally, state law has much stricter groundwater monitoring, and as you saw, that makes a big deal in Hanford cleanup.
We're on to what you can do about this, and you're already here tonight, which is great. And we really want to encourage people to send in comments. Where to send them in is on this fact sheet and the Tri-Party Agreement Agency fact sheet. This presentation is on our homepage, the link to it, hoanw.org, along with the fact sheet. And here are some suggested comments. And they need to hear this tonight. 1, retrieve and dispose all the plutonium and the other chemicals and radionuclides, not stopping at 2 feet below the surface, not even stopping at 15 feet below the surface when you can get to it. Dig up, this is a permanent remedy. If you dig it up and treat it, that's what we call a permanent remedy. If you put a dirt cap over it and say, we'll tell people not to dig here, that's called an institutional control. It's going to fail. Best example of a failure of an institutional control, look at Harbor Island. 5 years after the Superfund cleanup was completed, where they capped the contamination, the Port of Seattle allowed its contractor to dig up, exposing the workers, releasing contamination into Elliott Bay, and having hazardous waste hauled away to be used at construction sites around Puget Sound. It took only 5 years for people to forget that it was a Superfund site. So urge that we have a real cleanup, not a cover-up. Insist that the plutonium that is dug up go to a deep underground repository, not go just into another landfill at Hanford. Plutonium doesn't belong in a landfill. It belongs deep underground. One of the problems we've got is that the Energy Department has one repository in a salt mine in New Mexico, and all the soil that's contaminated with plutonium would overwhelm the quantity allowed in that mine. So rather than expand it or seek to build a new one, the Energy Department is saying most of the plutonium we dig up we'll just put into a landfill at Hanford or other sites. It belongs in a deep geologic repository. Don't let the agencies get away with saying the plutonium is going to stay where it is. Turns out that their claim about having investigated is that they looked for plutonium in 1959 and 1970, and they're using that to say we know where it is today. It's baloney. We need to have a real investigation. We need to have acknowledgement and use of the Department of Energy's own data of where the plutonium and the other contaminants are going to move to groundwater from their own tank closure waste management EIS from last year, not ignoring their own modeling. And we want them to adopt a cleanup standard that is the same as the cleanup standard used at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, 2.5 picocuries per gram. If it's good enough for the Energy Department to do in California, that's what we should be doing here. If it can be done there, it can be done here. Not 2,900, 2.5. And finally, insist that they go back and do a real investigation, not rely on what they did in 1959 and 1970, when the Energy Department didn't even admit until 1986 that hazardous waste laws were something it had to comply with. Okay, thank everyone. Thank you all for coming early. Thank you, Ross. Great job.